So while the United States is, fully investing in this war effort and creating this sense of like this is a united effort, this is a patriotic thing, but also this is the fight for American democracy, this is the fight for freedom and justice abroad. The reality is that many people at home in the United States were not feeling that democracy, freedom, justice, that the United States was touting abroad. And so we're going to look at some examples of that. One being, first, the fact that the United States was going to fight this fascism and this injustice that was happening abroad using segregated military, servicemen, right? And so you have segregation and discrimination in the military and in the war industry itself, right? So within the war industry, right, as a lot of white men were being sent out to fight, you have all these positions open for workers. And so this is going to be a big part of the draw for the second great migration of Black people out of the South to go to look for jobs in cities in war industries. And so this is where you especially have, for example, in Chicago and the Midwest, but very much so here in California, Los Angeles and the Bay Area. You have shipyards in Los Angeles and especially in the Bay Area, in Oakland, Richmond, that draw a large population of African Americans from the South. And that's where you can have the major Black populations in those cities first develop. But when people kind of are leaving the South and they come out to the war industry and thinking, okay, well, they need workers, right? But once they got to the plants, they often found there still was this kind of hierarchy in place of who gets dibs on the jobs. And it was very much based on a combination of race and gender. And Black people found often that they faced what they had faced in many situations, that they were the last hired, first fired, right? Is that when there was a need for workers, they brought in all the white workers first the men, then the women, and then last would be, Black men or Black women. And then once, they're going to have to downsize and lay off people or fire people, it would be the Black workers that were first to go. You also had a disproportionate amount of African Americans enlist in the military, right? Volunteer to fight in this war. Many of those soldiers became part of what was called the Wwii campaign, right? So we have like the peace sign that we make today, but the peace sign originally started as a victory, V for victory sign. And so like people would hold up the V for victory during the war, right? As hopes for victory abroad. But Black soldiers were saying, okay, well, yeah, we want victory abroad against fascism, but we're also invested in victory at home against racism. And so that Wwii campaign kind of brought to the surface the hypocrisy of going out to fight for the freedom and justice in other places, but denying those fighting for that freedom and justice, their own freedom and justice at home. Just like in World War I, the image of Black soldiers in uniform and then traveling from place to place, but also being stationed at different places and intermixing with white soldiers who were coming from the Deep South and different places, caused a lot of race riots. They also had soldiers coming back from serving abroad and then facing, segregation, facing being called a boy, being denied service, and so on. So you had riots break out during the war here at home in Detroit, in Harlem, Texas, and in Guam, right? Because the United States has military bases in Guam, right, which is near the Philippines. And you have soldiers having, conflicts with each other over race, and then those breaking out into race riots. You're going to read a little bit about the experience of one of these African-American soldiers, sorry for the typo, in World War II. It's a PDF on Canvas, and you're going to answer the following questions. What are the contradictions or problems the soldier points out and describes in his letter? And then explain how the soldier's description contradicts what Roosevelt said about America that you read earlier in the first reading. Another major contradiction of what the United States said it was fighting for and against, and then what was happening at home, was Japanese internment, what's called Japanese internment. But what we're talking about is, essentially concentration camps of Japanese people in the United States. And so this played upon a long history of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States that was similar to the anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States, even though the Japanese population in the United States was relatively small. You had only about 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, JAs, Japanese Americans, concentrated mainly on the West Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington, because of the proximity to Hawaii, where many people came through before coming to the mainland, and also because it's across the Pacific, right? And so this is the Pacific Rim. And so this is where you have Japanese. The Japanese were also excluded from immigrating to the United States, like the Chinese, through the Gentleman's Agreement. And so many of the people that were Japanese in the United States were actually Japanese American, right? They were born in the United States, second generation, some even third generation Japanese American, had no other tie to Japan other than that's where their parents or grandparents were from, right? Over 2/3 of the people in the United States who were of Japanese ancestry were U.S. citizens, also known as Nisei, the second generation. So the first generation people who are the immigrants are the Issei. Second generation are the Nisei. Third generation are the Sansei, right? Based on the Japanese, each Nissan, right? The 1, 2, 3. So the U.S. is at war with Japan. The small population of Japanese and Japanese Americans in the U.S. are mainly on the West Coast. The majority of those people are U.S. citizens born in the U.S. with U.S. citizenship. The problem is, as you have with most, the perception of most Asian people in the United States, even today, is this kind of problem of being deemed forever foreign. This is how I call it. A lot of Latin American people have this as well, especially if you are not white Latin American, right? There's a sense that doesn't matter how long you've been here, doesn't matter if you were born here, doesn't matter if you're a second, third, fourth generation born in the United States, you are forever categorized as actually from somewhere else, not a real American, right? So the Japanese face this kind of being categorized as forever foreign, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced this. If someone asks you, where are you from? And you say I'm from LA. No, but where are you really from? You could be born in LA. Your parents could be born in LA. But if you are not a white American or even a black American, right? People are like, well, no, but where are you really from? With the assumption that you can't possibly be an American. You're not like a regular American, a real American, right? And that comes from a lot of things that we've learned about in terms of the shaping of what an American is supposed to look like and who is rightfully an American. So you have these Japanese and Japanese Americans, all of them, all people of Japanese ancestry in the United States, got categorized as enemy aliens. Even the citizens, right? So the Japanese were categorized as enemy aliens, and immediately after the United States, and people are reeling over Pearl Harbor and the amount of attacks on Japanese people after Pearl Harbor, like kids were being beat up at school and stuff after that, right? Something similar to what happened with the 9/11 attacks, and then just random hate crimes against anyone perceived to be, Muslim or Middle Eastern. Same thing, right? It's very as American as apple pie, right? So this lashing out at the people who are perceived as different and to blame for something, right? Almost immediately you had FBI surveillance of Japanese community organizations, Japanese community leaders. You have a curfew put in place on only Japanese people, which eventually led to a notice of evacuation that you're going to be removed from this area. You have them recording down how many people are in your family, who is everyone, keeping a record of where everyone was located. Many Japanese and Japanese American community leaders were arrested. You could be like the pastor at a Japanese American church, or the leader of a Japanese American Boy Scout troop, or you I don't know, teach Japanese at the temple, whatever it is. If you're considered a leader some way, you were, in some way you were considered like suspicious. As a military necessity, you would be arrested and interrogated. And it happened to a lot of people. Like, there are certain communities in Los Angeles, like San Pedro is a major Japanese American community, obviously Little Tokyo, Gardena. These were areas where there was like San Gabriel, large Japanese American population. And people from all of those places were arrested by the FBI and brought in. And then the most sweeping kind of major injustice that was done happened on February 19th, 1942, about 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which ordered that all people in the United States of Japanese ancestry had to evacuate. And so they posted up orders and they said it on the radio on specific dates in specific zones or areas where Japanese people live. They had a specific date where they had to bring only what they could carry and meet at a given point where they would be loaded onto buses and taken to a processing center. And from the processing center, they were taken to evacuation camps, usually like far out in the mountains or in the desert, right? To remove the Japanese from places where they could be spies or do some kind of, damage to military centers. There were 10 camps that were opened, and all of these people, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, right, and entitled to the rights under the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, they were essentially arrested without any due process. No charge was made against them. They had no right to challenge it in court. They had no right to represent themselves with an attorney and present their case. None of that. Simply because of where your family or your ancestors were from, you are suspect, and now you are going to be rounded up. And there were a lot of Americans who were on board with this, not only because it was a threat, like in their minds they're at war, but because there was a severe anti-Japanese sentiment. You can see from this picture this woman has here, right? And the term Japs is a slur, a racial slur. And all slurs are just words, right? But it's the meaning that they're given during a specific historic period that makes them offensive, because they're usually tied to a lot of mistreatment and pain that people went through. And so Japs became the slur for Japanese people, usually said in a negative way, as you can see here in the sign. So the notifications were posted up everywhere, and people had to assemble at different places. Now, people say, oh, this was a military necessity, but all you have to do is realize the Japanese in Hawaii were not put in camps. Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor is, closer to Japan than anywhere in the mainland of the U.S., had a very large Japanese population because they were the workers on the plantations. If the Japanese, just by being Japanese, are a threat to the U.S. military, why would you not also put in the camps the Japanese in Hawaii? Well, because the agricultural companies would all shut down without Japanese labor. So just by looking at that, you can see that there are other motives. There are other motives for putting the Japanese in camps. One big reason for this is on the West Coast, especially here in California, but all the way up the coast, the Japanese were very successful farmers. They ran small family farms where in certain industries like beets or even in growing flowers, they were extremely successful. And as we've seen, right, success is often a lightning rod for, the anger of Americans who feel like they are more entitled to that success than some other group that doesn't belong here, right? So when Japanese people got interned, and here's a photograph of the camps, Japanese internment, or this being put in these concentration camps, was actually an opportunity for others. Japanese people were given very little notice of when they had to evacuate. Many people did not have time to sell their houses or to find someone. The Japanese community is very insular, meaning because of the mistreatment, because of the exclusion, most Japanese Americans only knew other Japanese Americans for the most part, right? So if everyone you know is being sent to these camps, who then can you leave your house to be looked after to? Who can take care of your business while you're gone? Who can mind your farm? There's nobody. So this became an opportunity for, white farmers to buy up very cheaply with an advantage farmland, right? To buy up businesses. And then the government could use this to calm people's fears about another Pearl Harbor or spies. People were like calling the police and the FBI and like, I think my neighbor's a spy, right? Like whatever. So to calm people's fears, look, we've taken care of the problem. Now, mind you, the United States is not only at war with Japan, the United States is also at war with Germany and Italy. And you have a much, much larger population of German immigrants, not citizens, not U.S. citizens, German immigrants, and you have a much, much larger population of Italian immigrants in the United States. But you don't have a mass internment and arrest of all the Germans and German Americans. That's a lot of people. And that's a lot of people who feel they are rightfully American. A lot of Italians and Italian Americans, again, not interned. You did have undoubtedly mistreatment of German people and Italian people, especially immigrants, right? Which is, again, the American way, right? So just lashing out at people violently. And you had some Germans and Italians who got interned in the camps too, mainly because they were outspoken Nazi sympathizers or Mussolini supporters. They had a reason. They were like supporting the enemy. So they were getting interned and they were interviewed and interrogated as well. But only they were immigrant suspects, not citizens, not people guilty simply because of their race and ethnicity. So this became like this is just the way. And many Japanese people had to struggle with, okay, so what do we do? Right? What do we do? Do we resist? No, for many of the Japanese, they felt, let's just try and fly below the radar. Let's just do what they're asking us to do. And again, they're being sent to these camps with no sense of like, how long are you going to be there? Or what's going to happen to your stuff? Or do your families get to stay together? They were sent first to processing camps. So around us here in Los Angeles, Santa Anita Racetrack was one processing camp. The Pomona Fairgrounds was another processing camp where they first had to stay a few days. Everyone got processed, written down, everything, information, everything. And then they were put on trains and buses and sent to far out camps like Manzanar or Heart Mountain or different places like Wyoming, the desert of California, Utah, and so on. Many people in the Japanese community just kind of said, let's just suck it up. And some people said, well, maybe this is our way. We can prove that we're real Americans, even though many of them are real Americans, right? They are U.S. citizens. They felt like, well, we're being treated like we don't belong, so we shouldn't do anything to like affirm that. Let's just, smile and do the best we can and not complain. The media really played into this, and there was a lot of propaganda as well. So you have while the Japanese are being interned, the Chinese have a different experience. Because now in World War II, China is a U.S. ally, right? And one thing that becoming an ally with China did was the U.S. now is kind of pressured to remove the Chinese Exclusion Act. Like, oh, haha, yes, we did, target your people and exclude them from immigration, and that makes your country look very bad. But now we're friends, so now they have to respin the image of the Chinese in the United States with this propaganda of like, they're on our side, these are the good ones. And magazine articles, in like Life magazine, Time magazine, tried to do this kind of public relations, mental gymnastics switching up to support this. So for example, in Life magazine in 1941, they printed this article here that's entitled, How to Tell the Japs from the Chinese. Okay, so it is horrifying on many levels, right? But this idea that you could, by certain features on the face, tell whether they were the good guys or the bad guys. And then you have these two photographs, like, with these descriptions of skin tones and nose bridges and cheeks and whatever else. How to tell Chinese from the Japanese. And you have this photograph of this Chinese American reporter here who has a sign. You can't really see it here, but he pinned it to his coat, where it says Chinese reporter, not Japanese. Okay, so like, please don't like jump me or like, like yell at me or, kick me out or whatever. You have to prove that you're one of the good ones. Time magazine did a similar thing. How to tell your friends from the Japs. Okay. I'm sorry. This is just, it's really outrageous, because what it does is, one, it's ridiculous to think that there are a set of features to tell one nationality from another. But two, which is, based on this kind of pseudoscience of race, but two, why? Why do you need to tell one group from the other? So you know who to mistreat? You gotta think about that. So you're essentially saying it's okay to mistreat and exclude one group of people, inform on them and like whatever, but this other group, now we are, I know you used to hate these people too, but now we're going to be friendly with them. Right? So it's a very weird way of thinking about how to treat other people. But it hasn't gone away. I wanted to include this here as well. This was printed in the Chicago Tribune, the magazine that comes with the Chicago Tribune newspaper, in 2012, when the United States was at war in Afghanistan. They printed this thing called the Turban Primer. A primer is kind of like a little handbook, a little sheet that can give you basic information. Again, pointing out different types of turbans. For what purpose? So you know who to inform upon, who to suspect, who to mistreat. But even the idea that you can tell one person from another based on the way they wrap their hair is pretty outrageous in and of itself. Now, when the Japanese were interned, you had challenges, right? People were like, this is not right. Not everybody in the community was like, okay, let's just go along with it. Of course, nobody was happy about being interned. It was like life-altering consequences for people. They lost their businesses. They lost their jobs. People had to leave university in the middle of their studies. People had to, leave their neighborhoods, and some people and there were interracial marriages as well, not with white people, but with others. And there were interracial relationships, and people had to leave people behind. You have this Japanese-owned grocery here, where their protest was to put up a sign saying, "I am an American." Right? It's like such a heartrending kind of plea that really falls on deaf ears, right? Because it doesn't matter that you were born here or your parents are born here. It's what race you are and how you're perceived by the general public. So you had challenges to the injuries of internment. There were some people who resisted internment, refusing to go, or suing the U.S. government. So Minoru Yasu and Gordon Hirabayashi both sued the state, saying that they were having their 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under the law violated. Fred Korematsu, who's pictured here with his family, was from, I believe, Oakland, the Bay Area. He's like in the back on the right. He was a young man. He was dating a white woman, and he was like, maybe he was a teenager, I'm not sure, but he didn't want to leave. And so he hid out, avoiding internment, and then resisted a number of ways, including trying to use the law to challenge internment. And then you have the case of Ralph Lazo, which is a really interesting case. Here in Los Angeles in Boyle Heights, you had a large Japanese American population, so East LA, Boyle Heights. And in that area, you had a diversity of first and second generation and third generation Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans, Armenian Americans, Jewish Americans, a diverse group of people that were essentially kind of excluded from living in other places, right? And so Ralph Lazo was a Mexican American who went to Roosevelt High School, and Roosevelt High School had a large Japanese American population that all of a sudden got interned. And so a lot of his friends were Japanese American, and he decided, I'm going to go with you. He went. He was one of like maybe 4 or 5 non-Japanese people who just went to internment, either to stick with people that they knew or as a form of protest. And I believe a movie was made about Ralph Lazo's experience of what he witnessed being outside of the Japanese community, but in the internment camps. And then you had a group of people called the No-No Boys. So the No-No Boys were, when the Japanese were interned, they all had to fill out a questionnaire from the U.S. government. And there's a bunch of different questions about people's backgrounds, about where they lived, and so on. And there were 2 questions on the questionnaire that some people had difficulty with. The first one was, do you promise to relinquish all loyalty to Japan, including your citizenship to the Japanese Empire? And a lot of people had difficulty with that because some people were only citizens of Japan. And because the United States would not allow the Japanese immigrants to become citizens, if they gave up their Japanese citizenship, then they would be citizens of nowhere and with no government protection from anyone. So that was difficult for many people, especially older people who are like, what, we're here and this is how we're being treated. Like how are we going to give up our citizenship and any kind of hope of protection or any hope of going home even, ever, right? So it cut your ties to your homeland. The second question that people had difficulty was, do you volunteer to join the U.S. Army? This is for men. And there were people who looked at that and said, you're putting us in camps, but you want us to go and risk our lives to fight on behalf of this country. Many Japanese Americans did. They said, yes, this is a way, again, of proving, or yeah, I'm an American, of course I'm going to go fight, right? But there were people who resisted, and they marked no and no on both of those questions. And they were called the No-No Boys. And they were doing this out of resistance, out of anger against what was happening to them and their families, out of resentment for the things that they lost. And then when the war was over, many of those No-No Boys were shamed within the Japanese community as making the community look bad, as why not just go along with what was happening and then we can go back to our lives afterwards. In the end, no Japanese or Japanese Americans were ever found guilty of sabotage or espionage or anything that they were being accused of. None. Nothing. And then, in the end, December 17th, 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that these camps were unconstitutional, and the camps were closed, and the people were sent home. So you have 2.5 years of people sitting in these camps without, any knowledge of what's going to happen to them, without any compensation for all the business and, personal loss that they faced in being in the camps. And many people just went back to their homes or to their lives and tried to rebuild without complaint. Many people went back to find that they were no longer wanted in their neighborhoods, that their businesses had been ransacked, that the people they had trusted to take care of their things had cheated them. Other people came back and found that they were able to move back into their neighborhoods or that people had taken care of their stuff. Regardless, the being put in the camps was a traumatic event for many people. And within the Japanese community and within Japanese culture, many adults, parents and grandparents, decided, okay, it's done. Let's not talk about it anymore. Let's just put it behind us. So the next generation that came up, many of the children and grandchildren of people that were in internment camps had no idea that this even happened. And it wasn't included in history books. It wasn't anywhere to be found. And then when those young people found out that this has happened, then they were in the throes of the civil rights movement. And people began to say, no, this is an injustice that happened to us that somebody needs to do something about. But this was a highlighted contradiction between what the United States was saying it was fighting for and then what was actually happening to people under its own policies. So this kind of brings up the question of who is an American, right? If you're saying, this is we're fighting for American democracy, who is included in that vision of democracy? Now, we've learned a lot in this class so far to know that it's a very precarious thing that changes over time, and the ideas of who is entitled to things shifts and doesn't come without people fighting and resisting and so on. Well, one way that some people found as a possible means of gaining their rights or their right to feel entitled to demanding their rights was through military service, right? As that many people found that, like, hey, and this is why immigrants often have a disproportionate enlistment in the military in the U.S. historically, right? There's this sense that, like, military service is a way to prove that I am on the side of this nation, and I belong here, and I deserve the rights that I've been, told I am entitled to. So we see that during Japanese internment, you had Japanese Americans enlisting in the military. But just like African American soldiers, they were segregated, right? So Japanese American soldiers only fought in specifically Japanese American troops. And there were 3 major troops, the 442nd, the 100th, and the 522nd, all segregated. And they were not sent to the Pacific Theater, meaning they could not fight against Japan. They were only sent to fight in the European theater. Again, with this idea that they're not really Americans, they're really Japanese, and they could defect or whatever else, right? But the Japanese were not the only group during this time that had disproportionately high enrollment, despite perhaps mistreatment at home. Mexican Americans also served and enrolled in the military and served at disproportionately higher rates than their population. So you had about 300,000 Mexican Americans or Chicanos served in World War II. At the same time, Mexican Americans were facing a lot of conflict and mistreatment in the United States, especially in the Southwest and here in Southern California. At the same time, you have this disproportionate enlistment of Mexican Americans in the U.S. military, in the Army, in the Navy. You also had conflict between Mexican Americans in LA and the police. And LA Times was constantly running smear campaigns on Chicano youth. And then you ended up having the Zoot Suit riot in Los Angeles between servicemen, specifically people from the Navy who were being stationed here in LA, and many of them were white from other parts of the United States, against Mexican American youth. And that was the Zoot Suit riot. And you'll see a little video clip on that. You also had, in the Great Depression, the mistreatment of Mexican Americans in terms of being forcibly deported, Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Now there was a labor shortage in World War II. And so the United States reversed its policy on repatriation or deporting Mexicans and created the Bracero program. So starting in 1942, the United States started this program where they would send recruiters to the other side of the border to hire and contract agricultural workers that would be given 1-year contracts that they could renew every year to give them legal permission to be in the United States, right? So, 10 years before, rounding up people and forcibly deporting them and like, oh, actually, we need you back, going down there and like rounding people up to bring into the United States for labor contracts. So many people saw this as, this is messed up, right? This is a highlighting the fact that you only see us as kind of a labor pool, and we're not entitled to like the security and the rights of others working in the United States, right? And so you have these kind of contradictions on the ground, very clear to many people. And then finally, Native Americans. They enlist in the military at a disproportionate rate as well. And famously, we know about the Navajo code talkers. Native Americans enlisted in large part because, again, that sense of like, well, we are Americans and, this is how I can access my rights. The reservations were a difficult place to live, and here's some opportunity, just like for Chicanos, like, living in, low income areas with very little opportunity. Military was a way to kind of, do kind of honest work or to gain some kind of route to the future. So the U.S. military recruited Native Americans into the military, especially those who spoke native languages, because native languages could be used for codes, to send codes between different units without them being able to be broken, right? So the Navajo language was used as a code to send information that the Japanese could not intercept and decode. And it wasn't just the Navajo, other nations as well were code talkers as well, but you're going to watch a little video on that too.